One of the trends that I've been railing against most recently has been cynicism. There's this pervasive belief that everything is terrible and it can't get better.
Yeah.
And the people who believe that it can improve are dumb and delusional and the problem. And I don't know where it comes from. I don't like it.
Well, it's the beginning of wisdom, cynicism. This is part of the reason why it's hard to combat, because people start out naive. And naive people are optimistic, but not really. They're just naive. And naive people have no idea that there's, say, malevolence in the world. They have no idea that there's malevolence in their own heart. They're sheltered and dependent. And when that breaks, it often breaks into cynicism. And so cynicism is actually an improvement.
Because the veils have fallen from your eyes.
Exactly. The problem with cynicism is that, especially if it's allied with a kind of arrogance, is that you can end there. And that's a big mistake. So then the question becomes, well, once you've been bitten hard and you're no longer naive, well, that is very hard on your optimism, let's say. So then the question is, how do you restore that without reverting to the naivety, which you can't do anyways without blinding yourself once you've been bitten? And the answer to that is you substitute courage for naivety and you regain your optimism as a moral imperative. Right? So one of the things you might ask yourself is, well, if the future is likely to be catastrophic in a variety of different ways, which is definitely the case, both socially and personally, then what attitude should you bring to bear on that? And the answer might be, well, if you were courageous and faithful, and I can explain what that means, then you would conduct yourself in a manner that met the future head on, with the presumption that you can manage it. And this is the presumption we should bring to bear politically. Now, the people who are using fear to garner power point to the various apocalypses that might befall us. And it's difficult to counter them because the future is always an apocalyptic horizon. Like everything can fall apart and has before and might well again and will, in fact, in your life as you age and die. And so it's very easy to conjure up an apocalypse. Then the question becomes not, is that apocalypse potentially real? Because the answer to that is yes, but what attitude should you have towards that? Naive, that's not good. Cynical, that's better, but it's still not good. It's another form of hell, and it also tends to make the potential apocalypses more likely. Well, so what do you have when you move beyond cynicism? And what you have when you move beyond cynicism is wisdom. And that's not naive, it's courageous. And one of the things that religious people have done relatively badly, especially in recent years, is they've failed to delineate the relationship between faith and courage. People like Dawkins and the new atheists, they point to faith and they describe it as something like belief in foolish superstitions. But that isn't really what faith in the deepest sense means. It means that you are willing to act out the proposition that you can ride the wave no matter how big it becomes, and that we can all do that together, especially if we do that in goodwill. And I think it's a much more appropriate way to confront the future, and it's also the proper medication for cynicism. Now, the other thing about cynicism that's interesting too is that cynics aren't cynical enough about their own cynicism, right? Because you can get doubtful enough to start doubting the validity of your own cynicism. It's like, what makes you so smart? What makes you the judge of being? The Columbine kids were like that. They decided that existence itself was unsustainable given its cruelty, and that the proper response was to put up a giant middle finger to men and God, right? Well, here's a way of being cynical about cynicism. How does your cynicism let you off the hook, right? How does your cynicism justify your desire to avoid necessary responsibility and to pursue your own short-term hedonic gains? It's like, why aren't you cynical about your own doubt? And that's another place where wisdom begins. It's like that. So that's two, right? Cynicism beats naivety, but it's not the ultimate destination. And you should be cynical enough to question the moral validity of your own of your own resentment and your own, what would you say, your own turning away from the world.
The way that I see it, given that we don't know the future, given that much of our motivations are invisible to us, we're not a crystal pond that we can see into. You have to have some form of delusion about what's going to happen in the future. You're trying your best to see the way that it's going to be, but given that the glass could be half empty or half full, why not have a delusion that's going to be useful to you, one of hope, even in the face and the understanding that things might be difficult and that there's going to be obstacles?
You know, there was a line of social psychology that pursued that argument for quite a while, that made the argument that people had to have positive illusions about the future, and that was the fundamental way that people staved off despair and bolstered their self-esteem. But I don't think we need to separate out the distinction between fantasy and delusion. You do have a fantasy about the future. You have to, because like you said, it's not structured. So you have to provisionally map the future. That's what a plan is.
Positive
That's
goal.
what a strategy is.
Yeah.
Right. But that doesn't make it a delusion. Like, it becomes a delusion when the map bears no relationship to the underlying territory. So if you have a strategy for the future, maybe let's say that your strategy for the future, just for the sake of argument, is that you have 5 million YouTube subscribers in 3 years. Well, you have no evidence of the strict sort that that's how it's going to be, because anything could happen between now and 3 years from now, let's say. But there's no reason to call that a delusion. It's one hypothetically possible path of potential. And then you can make the sacrifices necessary to bring that about. So even though it's a fantasy because it maps something that isn't there, it's not a delusion. It's a delusion when you're ignoring elements of your own experience that would inform your fantasy more effectively. You're ignoring them so that you can live in a positive representation of the future without having to pay the appropriate price for it.